It's the morning after the night before. I was quite busy yesterday going to Wembley Stadium to watch Brentford Football Club qualify for the Premier League. Come on, you bees! It was a great team performance, and the sum was greater than the parts. It really shows what happens when players work together. It really was fantastic to see all season. I'm very pleased. So here we are. Let's look at a game from the semi-final of the FTX Crypto Cup. And I've been looking at the match between Carlsen and Rajabov. But now I want to switch and let's look at a game from the other semi-final between Nepomniachtchi and Wesley So. Golly, I barely know where to start. But, well, if I can take the comparison of players working together as a team, well, it's the same on the chessboard. I don't want to stretch the comparison too far. But when you get your pieces working in harmony, it makes a huge difference. So, let's take a look at this. So, first set of this match went to Wesley So. He edged it. So Nepo had to win this second set. First two games were drawn, and this was his chance in game 3 to he really had to use the white pieces to go for a win, and he played this very aggressively. Let's take a look how. So Wesley goes for this semi-Tarrasch, and this has a very solid reputation. Remember, he's happy just to draw this one and go into game 4 with the white pieces. So Nepo here plays rook to b1. Now, why rook b1 at this early stage? Well, it's all about keeping pieces on the board. The normal developing move would be knight f3, and then the main line goes like this, and black is able to exchange pieces. And this has a very decent reputation for black. It's difficult to break this down. So that's why Nepo played this mysterious rook move, rook b1, because it means that after this exchange, obviously there's no check on b4. Whoops, that was a misplaced arrow. There's no check here because the rook covers. So that is the point of rook b1. Downside is that white is slower with development. Bishop e7. And now here is where Nepo shows that he really wants to go for it in this game, because he plays h4. Yes, harry the h-pawn. Trundles up the board again. I tell you what, I can feel it. My voice has gone after yesterday. I did so much shouting and singing at Wembley. Yeah, here he uses harry the h-pawn. You don't have to play like that. You know, you can play for a win in other ways. You might well remember a game between Anand and Ho Ifan from Vacanze 2018. I recorded that on the channel. Do check out that video where Vichy just played bishop c4, and well, he won a beautiful classical game, managing to get the d-pawn down the board. Wonderful game. So when you're playing for a win, you don't necessarily have to play as aggressively as this, but h4, well, let's see what happens. We saw Raja defeat Carlsen with an early h-pawn advance, although that was quite positional. This is really very much to do with a kingside attack. Now, important that this pawn is blocked. I think if it gets to h6, then this is not only an asset in the middle game, but potentially in the endgame too. So the pawn is blocked, but that means that this diagonal is a bit weaker. obviously that's where white would like to attack. Bishop d3. Well, there is a downside to bishop d3. Of course, it's the diagonal the bishop wants to be on. But after this exchange, then the knight is attacking that d pawn. So, yeah, it wasn't necessarily the way to play. I mean, one could play rook h3 with the idea of rook g3, or maybe bishop c4 as Vichy did. That's possible. Anyway, bishop d3 takes, and knight c6. Yeah, this is a slight issue. So, you know, white has to decide how to deal with that. Not only that, the knight is ready to push that bishop away from this diagonal too. So Nepo just drops back with bishop e2. So this is now defended, but you know, that's a compromise really, to put the bishop back. Bishop b7, steady development from Wesley, and rook h3. So Nepo continues with his aggression on the king side. And Wesley is very steady here. He just goes rook c8. I mean, one way to play would be to go f5. You know, if you wanted to, you know, try to somehow, yeah, block the diagonal and set up like this. I mean, that is not a bad way to play. I guess it does leave these diagonals, that diagonal open and the g6 square weaker, but black could play like that. But I think it's interesting that Wesley just stays very calm actually and just plays rook c8. You know, having seen that this bishop has, you know, climbed down from that diagonal, seems like a sensible reaction actually. But rook g3, threat obviously, bishop takes pawn. King h8 steps out of the way, prevents that threat. And now a3 from Nepo. So he's covering that b4 square. I think king f1 might have been sensible here actually. But anyway, a3 played. Knight a5. Continuing in traditional way, and that threatens the pawn here. And now the bishop comes back again, now that the pressure is off. d4. Knight c4, that knight very keen to rejoin the action. And king f1, I think that's kind of an indication that there's no really clear way forward for white at the moment. And instead of grabbing a pawn, that kind of takes the knight offside. Knight d6, excellent move. Bringing the knight back into the middle, attacking the pawn on e4. So Nepo has to think carefully how to deal with this. Not easy. You know, if you play e5, that knight dives in here, attacks the rook, and of course if the rook moves, then knight c3 forks queen and rook. Therefore, d5. This typical pawn sacrifice in this opening, you know, opens up lines. If e5, which is very often the way to follow up, then in this case the knight will slam in on e4 and block out the bishop, so that's no good. But after this, Nepo played bishop b2, and the game is reaching, after just 20 moves, really boiling point actually, and black has to be so careful in this position. This can go very badly wrong. How would you defend against that attack? Well, f6 doesn't feel right because it weakens g6. You know, I suspect a move like e5 is going to open things up. Maybe simply taking on d5 actually. And this diagonal is weak, g6 is weak, doesn't look right. What about, well, bishop f6 is terrible because of e5. Okay, what about rook g8? Then queen d2 threatens that. Remember, there's a pin there. If f6, then you take here, and again that diagonal opens. These squares are very weak. Doesn't look right. Here, Wesley invested 3 minutes, and I think he came up with an excellent move, actually. This is a really brave decision. He took on e4 and allowed this pawn to be taken. Now, in rapid play, you need to, making a decision like this, you need to calculate very carefully. You need to check bishop takes pawn check. You need to check rook takes pawn. In the cold light of day, one can see perhaps that white isn't breaking through, but that takes a lot of courage when you don't have that much time to calculate. Nepo took on g7 check, and actually Wesley had judged correctly that there is no decent follow-up for white. For example, if the bishop drops back here, then simply rook g8, and actually there is no good follow-up for white. So Nepo took the rook, bishop takes. So at the moment white is the exchange up, however the pieces are forked. If the bishop drops back, then actually, well, obviously there's a pin here. That pawn takes knight is illegal. But knight f5 is a very strong move, attacking this and opening up the d file. So after this, you can take here and the bishop drops. So the tactics are working for black. So rook g4, and Wesley takes the bishop. So now we've got a material balance of 2 minor pieces. Well, 2 bishops against a rook. And black has a very big pawn here as well. If queen d3 check, then f5. And actually, black is safe enough there. Rook d4. And now rook c3. Covering that pawn. So if rook takes, then we have bishop a6 and a nice pin. And Wesley has managed to coordinate his pieces. I mean, this is what I mentioned at the start. You know, they're working like a football team. Players are working together, and that's what is happening with black's pieces here. That although that rook looks like it's out on a limb just for the moment, it gets attacked, but actually it's defended. So everything is defended. The queen protects the rook protects the pawn. The minor pieces are safe. That knight on d6 is in the middle without pawn protection, but it's covered by the bishop and covered by the queen. And the knight covers this pawn. You see, everything is protected. The pieces are working beautifully together. Queen f4. So Nepo trying to move over to the king side. And Wesley makes a very practical decision here. He exchanges off that beautiful bishop, but getting rid of that knight cuts out tactics. It's just a good move. Here, if queen takes, then rook c1 check is winning immediately. So pawn takes, not a beautiful move for white to make, but necessary. And now Wesley just plays very practically. He decides just to trade pieces. Why not? Just takes the pressure off. Rook d1, he exchanged again and played queen c4. Well, he knows that even if he gives up this pawn, if he can exchange queens, then he has a winning endgame with bishop and knight against rook and sound pawns over that side of the board. So Nepo's trying to keep the queens on, trying to give himself a glimmer of hope. Knight b5. Now that is a brave move, I would say, because at the moment black has everything protected here, but in order to win, he breaks that nice formation, but he's confident that he can still keep his pieces together. Now that's a pin, that's useful. Bishop takes pawn. So he's grabbed this pawn at the side of the board. That's going to be useful later on with these nice pawns. But the crucial thing is, Wesley realizes that he can still coordinate those minor pieces. So first of all, that bishop reaches a beautiful spot protected by the pawn. And now this knight comes back into play. So again, he's managed to coordinate his pieces so that they're working together. Everything beautifully protected. And now he thinks, okay, I have enough time. Now that everything is protected, I have enough time to advance on the queen side. And of course, that means that Nepo has to go for it now, because this is a simple plan to advance this a-pawn all the way down the board. Rook e5. f6, that rook gets pushed. Now this might look a little bit strange to advance that f-pawn. The king is now a little bit exposed, but the reason Wesley's done this is because he realizes he can cut back with the queen and actually go on the attack himself. And that's a consequence of the weaknesses inflicted on white's kingside. Check. And knight takes f3. Hitting the queen, and now a counter-attack. Just crashes through. And that was the end of the game. So the rook attacked and queen h5 check follows, and white's king is going to get cut to pieces. So yeah, really nice technique from Wesley. He kept his cool all the way through this game. You know, if your opponent starts with h4, you're under pressure. You know, it's not easy to meet that, but very calm development with knight c6. You know, he just didn't panic at all. I found Nepo's play just a bit too aggressive, that's not the right way to put it. The aggression is fine, but he didn't do it very well. You know, if you're going to play like this, you need to know this system well. And here, I think bishop d3, to my eyes, looks a bit odd. Rook h3 or bishop c4 look far better to me, actually, than putting the bishop on d3. And even later on, yeah, there were some curious moves. I didn't quite understand a3. It seems to me that king f1 might have been a better try, just to push the king out of the way straight away. But okay, hindsight is a wonderful thing. But that was game 3, and well, winning that's basically the end of the set, because even if Nepo had won game 4, it would have been 2-2, a drawn set, and Wesley would go through anyway, having won the first set. I hope that makes sense. So Wesley So goes through to the final. Magnus Carlsen convincingly defeated Radjabov in the second set. My prediction that Radja was going to perhaps cause an upset didn't come to pass, and Carlsen was in really fine form, actually. So we have a final setup of Wesley So against Magnus Carlsen. It's going to be very interesting. Wesley is on excellent form, and we've seen him play very well in these online rapid play tournaments. So I'll be reporting later. Thanks very much for watching. Come on, you bees!